Yeah, I want to get back to why we're seeing a renewed interest. I mean, obviously, millennials have every generation has a different perspective on things, but I'm curious as to what was driving millennials to, I guess, answer the questions of our time with the answers that they're providing, particularly in terms of unionization. But Kayla, before we get to that, I know you're from Wisconsin, so you probably have you've had a upfront and close perspective on the attack on unions. I mean, I think to a large extent, Scott Walker's.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I mean, so tell us. I mean, give us your perspective on. We opened up this segment by the introduction. We have been talking about the assault on unions for 15 years. Frankly, just as long as we've been on, but that assault has been bigger than that and longer than that. What just outline it, like, from the perspective of a millennial, like, what has been, how do they see that assault on unions?
Yes, so I'm from Wisconsin. I'm a fifth generation Wisconsinite. I didn't really grow up with any type of understanding of unions. I went to a public high school, and those teachers were unionized. I had assumed, but I didn't really know much about it. And then in 2011, during my junior year of college, Scott Walker signed Act 10, which stripped away the collective bargaining rights from public sector workers in my home state. And people were protesting in the streets, and I learned so much about how the labor movement a lot of it had actually started in Wisconsin, where the first public sector union, AFSCME, was actually formed. So that kind of started my interest in the labor movement. So I actually do have Scott Walker to thank for me being a union leader at this time. But I think that millennials see through the narrative that teachers are the problem, public sector workers are the problem. I mean, the decline in unionization has caused wages to stagnate. It's stripped away people's retirement to access to health care, to retirement. And so I think they see unions as a way to have a voice on the job and to get these things such as higher wages and have a more stable life that we've been promised, but haven't been able to get without these union drives.
You know, it's interesting. And I think I've told the story on the Majority Report, but back in 2009, I believe it was, Janine Groffel and I hosted some show out in Aspen that involved Grover Norquist, and it wasn't televised or anything like that. And Grover Norquist, for every answer, kept saying, the problem is the pension size of the public sector unions. And it was almost bizarre, his fixation on it, but it turns out that what we saw from Scott Walker was the culmination of a plan that had been going around for a long time to attack public sector unions. It was almost a proof of concept. If you could do it in Wisconsin, you could do it almost anywhere. And in fact, we did see multiple states, and ultimately we have now seen a full frontal assault on public sector unions by the Supreme Court in the form of the Janus decision. So we have, on one hand, we have unions in their least structurally, I guess, safe a position that they've been in the history of the country. We have virtually, right to work laws, so-called right to work laws, federally, as a function of the Janus ruling, and we have this in many states. So, how is it, Katie? Do you explain this sort of dichotomy where, on one hand, unions, if you look at them on paper structurally, are in their weakest position, but oddly enough, seem to be like in their strongest position that we've seen in a couple of decades?
Well, I would say that, as wages have stagnated and, the American worker's been kind of neglected, that unions have become all the more appealing. And so we've seen with, our members that we're living in expensive cities like Washington, D.C., and that it's appealing to be able to negotiate for a minimum salary and annual raises. And so one of our units, the employees of the Center for American Progress, in their first contract, negotiated for raises and minimum earnings that raised salaries in the unit by almost 10%. But we're also seeing this among other groups of newly organized workers, like digital journalists, who negotiated for salary floors of $50,000. They also live in expensive cities like New York, and then annual raises every year. So I think that workers are seeing the only way to kind of make their situation better is by joining together and having a seat at the table to negotiate with their employer.
Ethan, what do you think it is? What was Kayla has told us that her sort of almost like awakening moment was those strikes in largely in Madison, where we had for at least, I think, 3 or 4 months. We had people marching into the Capitol, occupying the Capitol, marching around the Capitol. I was there in, I think it was March of 2011, which may have been one of the last weekends that this was taking place. There were tractors, farmers had been driving in. There was just an incredible mix of workers who were protesting. But broadly speaking, Ethan, what defined, I guess, the perspective of millennials? What events define the perspective of millennials, would you say, based on your experience or just millennials you've spoken to?
Yeah, well, I think first it's important to remember that, millennials, like every other, group and generation in the U.S. workforce, ultimately want to be able to, pay their rent, put food on the table, support what are now many growing families for many millennials. And right now we're about 35% of all working adults. But I think if you go back, 5, 10 years and you look at the financial crisis, which, wiped out the wealth and the incomes for many, many Americans, and yet the people who caused the crisis, many of the CEOs at major corporations and banks, were not held to account. You look at the rising levels of student debt that many generations before us, I think our parents' generation had to deal with a little bit, but definitely not anywhere close to the scale that our generation is facing, where people are graduating college with 6 figures of debt and then facing a job market where they're being expected to be full-time freelancers for a piecemeal rate in living in New York City. So I think all these factors combined, together with, quite frankly, the political climate that we're in, I think the election of Donald Trump, I think, motivated a lot of people to think about ways that they can make changes in their own communities, whether that's the local organizing that we're seeing across the country on issues from, the minimum wage to making sure that in New York that economic development incentives aren't only going to the super rich, and then even to workplaces and people like being able to make a difference and actually make changes that directly impact them. I think many people don't know what they're missing when it comes to their jobs and being able to negotiate, sit down with their employer and their manager instead of being just coming in and saying, I want to raise.
I'll take what you're offering. Well, Ethan, all right, let's take a quick break here, and when we come back, I want to talk more about this and about millennials exerting their power. We'll be right back after this.